Capitol Hill, where the House January 6 committee held its 7th public hearing Tuesday. The panel helped paint a picture of the events leading up to the attack on the U.S. Capitol, including a, quote, unhinged meeting in the White House, where former President Trump was discussing efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The hearing also provided more insight into just how connected Mr. Trump is to far-right extremist groups. Scott MacFarlane reports.
The committee argued today the attack that erupted at the Capitol was ignited 18 days earlier with an overnight tweet from former President Trump that was a call to arms to march on Washington.
Trump repeated his big lie and claimed it was, quote, statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election before calling for a big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild.
Far-right groups and conspiracy theorists immediately latched onto it as a battle cry.
President Trump, in the early morning hours today, tweeted that he wants the American people to march on Washington, D.C.
A former employee of Twitter, whose identity was kept secret, said online reaction to Trump's tweet was frightening.
A mob was being organized, and they were gathering together their weaponry and their logic and their reasonings behind why they were prepared to fight.
But it wasn't just far-right groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. Stephen Ayers of Ohio, who pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct at the Capitol, said many were hanging on Trump's every word and that Trump could have convinced the mob to go home at any time January 6th.
So why'd you decide to march to the Capitol?
Well, basically, the president, got everybody riled up, told everybody to head on down. So we basically were just following what he said.
The committee revealed messages of frustration from some Trump allies on the 6th. Former campaign manager Brad Parscale writing a sitting president asking for civil war and that Trump's rhetoric killed someone. Committee members revealed for the first time clips of their long-sought deposition with former Trump White House counsel Pat Cipollone.
I don't think any of these people were providing the president with good advice.
They focused on an extraordinary marathon December 18th meeting in the White House, in which Cipollone battled with the president's outside advisors, including controversial attorney Sidney Powell, who presented a draft executive order calling for the military to round up voting machines in search of fraud.
To have the federal government seize voting machines, it's a terrible idea for the country.
What they were proposing, I thought, was nuts.
Wyoming Republican Liz Cheney said Trump's allies are now trying to blame his behavior on so-called crazy outside advisors.
This, of course, is nonsense. President Trump is a 76-year-old man. He is not an impressionable child.
For more, let's bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett, and CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa. It's good to be with all of you. Scott, I want to start with you. That email, it's going to be wild. We saw today how that spread throughout the echo chamber of the pro-Trump world. You've covered all of the people who were arrested on that day, who are fighting through the legal process. How much does that tweet come back up in those proceedings?
It comes up quite a bit, John. It was a battle cry, according to the committee. As soon as Trump issued that tweet in the overnight hours of December 19th, it was immediately picked up upon by some of those far-right or conspiracy theorists. It was just 3 or 4 days later, the accused Oath Keepers were talking about a plan for January 6th and bringing thousands of people. But what was most striking today was the voice of that January 6th defendant, not aligned with far-right groups, Stephen Ayers of Ohio. He referenced that tweet before January 6th, according to all the charging documents we read, and according to his signed guilty plea. It was galvanizing for him. He says Trump was galvanizing for others. That was a spark. And for all these weeks and months, we have focused on January 6th, the granular details, the moment by moment of that day. This hearing today really reinforced the significance of the week of December 19th. Between December 19th and December 25th, Christmas Day 2020, there were any number of far-right groups accused of plotting and planning, coming to January 6th with a game plan, with money, with arms, with a scheme, and that tweet, according to the committee, launched so much of it.
Major, I want to ask you about, as Scott mentioned, that important date of the 19th, but also the 18th of December. You've covered a lot of White House meetings. It's usually hard to get in to see the president. Yes. Give me your sense of that meeting and put it in the context of what a normal conversation in the Oval Office looks like.
Okay, so a normal conversation of the Oval Office is presidential advisors, and if there are outsiders welcomed in, everyone knows they're there, everyone knows why they're there, and everyone knows what the agenda of the meeting is. And there are contentious meetings of this kind, and they've happened in history before, but nothing like this, because the outsiders who were coming in were not really invited by anyone other than the president, and they were allowed in by one person, Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, who had control over access to the White House. And they met privately with the president, and then his top White House advisors, led by the White House counsel Pat Cipollone, get wind of this and come in with other White House attorneys and legal advisors to find out what the topic of this discussion is. They have reason to be alarmed, and that a reason for alarm was it was about suggesting to the president utterly outlandish, utterly illegal, anti-constitutional means to thwart what had just happened days before. What was that? On December 14th, something important happened. The Electoral College met, meaning those states all certified their Electoral College votes, and basically we had a new president-elect, Joseph R. Biden. But the president wasn't content with that, would not accept that, would not concede, despite the advice of many people within the White House and his own campaign. So we had these outside, quote-unquote, legal advisors telling him things that weren't true about the election and weren't true about U.S. law, and were certainly not true about the equities of the federal government to try to overturn elections at the state level. And that's when these other White House advisors, again, led by Cipollone, came in enraged and basically said, these people are telling you things, Mr. President, that are not only untrue, they're dangerous to the country, they're dangerous to your presidency, and this went round and round and round for some 6 hours, moving from the Oval Office to other locations, even up to the residence for a certain period of time. Ultimately, nothing happened. The outside advisors did not prevail, but they came dangerously close to prevailing, and that is the story the country is only beginning to learn, just how close things came to an extrajudicial seizing and overturning of a valid, verified, and utterly legal presidential election.
Bob, one of the things in that movable argument that was going through the White House on the 18th, as Major mentioned, Pat Cipollone was at the heart of that. He's been in the wings. Finally today, his testimony was revealed. What's your thinking about what we finally learned and how important he is to the narrative that the committee is trying to put together?
There are still many unanswered questions about what exactly Trump was being advised by Pat Cipollone, his White House counsel. What we saw today from his testimony were new details about outside players, like that meeting on December 18th, 2020, inside the Oval Office. Cipollone was a valuable witness in the sense that he provided even more evidence and testimony about what Sidney Powell was saying, what Eric Hirschman, a White House lawyer, was saying. But we didn't learn a lot, if anything. We didn't really learn anything about what exactly he was advising Trump. I mean, he skimmed the surface on a few of those questions about his general drift on how he saw the election and whether it was time to concede. But so much of the possible criminal jeopardy here for former President Trump is about his intent. And learning more about his intent would really be helpful to hear more from the White House counsel. But he didn't go there because of executive privilege reasons, in his view. That was a fence around his testimony in many ways.
Scott, we've got one more hearing to come. What do we know about when that's going to be and what it's going to cover?
Two sources speaking with CBS News say it will be in prime time. It'll be Thursday, July 21st, about 1 week later than maybe it was tentatively planned. They're going to focus on what the committee calls dereliction of duty. Multiple committee sources tell me it'll be led by Virginia Democrat Elaine Luria and retiring Republican from Illinois Adam Kinzinger, focusing on the hours, the minutes of the attack here itself, and what Donald Trump was doing or not doing, saying or tweeting or recording during that window of time. This is going to be, to a degree, a valedictory for the committee, but they're leaving open the possibility, if not the likelihood, of future hearings. This is a committee that's proven adept at moving the goalposts in terms of what they're going to do and when they're going to do it. They've been clear the investigation will continue after this slate of hearings is concluded, which really does raise the prospect of future hearings and future revelations. And we should add, they're expected to issue a written report, a final summary or coda to their investigation. And one committee staffer told me, watch for that report. Don't sleep on that. That may be the most profound thing this committee releases.
Major, I want to ask you about one revelation from today about January 6th. There's a text chain between Brad Parscale, who was the former campaign manager, and Katrina Pearson, and a senior advisor to President Trump in 2020. What struck you about that exchange?
That Brad Parscale, looking at the events of January 6th, said in a text he regretted helping elect President Trump. Brad Parscale was digital director of the Trump campaign in 2016, and he was for a short period of time in 2020 the campaign manager. But what Brad Parscale always took most pride in was marshaling and motivating the digital army that was the Trump movement. And what he came to see on January 6th was the undiscovered danger of mobilizing in a digital way through social media and other platforms some component parts of that Trump movement. It led to the storming of the Capitol. It led to injuries. It led to deaths. And Brad Parscale, according to these texts, was reconsidering and feeling a sense of collective guilt for putting that digital army together, marshaling it over and over again on Trump's behalf, and seeing what had become of it.
And finally, Bob, to you, Congresswoman Liz Cheney said in her closing statements that on Tuesday that former President Trump had called a January 6th committee witness that had not yet testified, and that the Justice Department had that information passed along to them. What's your take on that revelation?
If the president called a potential witness with the intent of obstructing that witness's testimony or tampering with it, that would be a serious charge, obstruction of justice. The committee has referred the fact that this phone call took place to the Justice Department. As a reporter, I would like to very much learn more about whom the former president called and why, whether the former president had any conversations behind the scenes. In the hours since the committee's hearing ended today, a spokesman for former President Trump threw cold water on some of this, didn't directly respond to the allegation, in at least the tweet I saw from one of Trump's spokespeople. But we see that this is a real point of contention for the committee. They feel that some of Trump's allies, and perhaps even the former president himself, are creating an atmosphere of pressure on witnesses in various ways. But that's still a story that needs more reporting.
Lots more of the story to come. Scott MacFarlane, Major Garrett, and Robert Costa. Thank you, gentlemen.